The transport ship cut through the thin atmosphere of Careth 9, its hull glowing faintly as friction met ice crystal clouds. The world beneath was an endless sheet of white-blue frost, a silent ocean of snow that reflected the cold light of a distant sun. The cadets pressed their faces to the reinforced glass as the craft descended, each breath misting the air with quiet anticipation. The Galactic Survival Academy had chosen this frozen moon for its most brutal trial. 3 nights without technology, 3 nights that had humbled even the strongest species in the galaxy. When the ship finally landed with a metallic groan, the ramp lowered, and a wave of freezing air rolled in, slicing into lungs like shards of glass. Evan Cole, the only human among the cadets, stepped out last. His boots sank into the powdery snow, and the cold bit through the layers of his standard-issue suit immediately. He took a deep breath, feeling it crystallize in his throat, and exhaled a slow plume that glowed silver under the pale sun. Around him, the others moved uncertainly. Tall insectoids from Zerath clicking their mandibles in distress, feathered Auralin cadets fluffing their plumage to trap heat, and scaled reptilians who already shivered, their blood cooling too quickly. The instructors watched from the ramp, unmoving, their faces hidden behind mirrored visors. When the loudspeaker crackled to life, a metallic voice announced the trial's conditions. Survive without the use of any technological aid. No heating modules, no protective domes, no plasma tools. Only instinct, skill, and cooperation. As the ship lifted off, leaving a swirl of snow in its wake, the vast silence of Careth 9 swallowed the group whole. The sound of the engines faded into the frozen horizon, and for a moment, the only thing that existed was the wind, a soft whisper that promised death if one listened too long. The cadets looked around, uncertain where to begin. Some tried activating small heat packs, only to see the warning lights blink red, deactivated remotely by the Academy's control system. The insectoid cadet from Zerath tried burrowing into the snow, but the surface crust broke easily, revealing colder layers beneath. A reptilian named Drav hissed in frustration, his scales turning dull from the cold. "We will not last a cycle," he muttered, his voice trembling more from temperature than fear. Evan didn't answer at first. He crouched and ran a gloved hand through the snow, feeling its texture, the way it compacted under pressure. It wasn't loose powder. The cold had made it dense, ideal for shaping. He stood up and scanned the horizon. There was no visible vegetation, no structures, and no caves within sight. The temperature was already dropping as the sun began to slide toward the horizon. The alien cadets began arguing about where to move, their voices rising in panic. Some wanted to march east toward a faint ridge, hoping to find rocks or shelter. Others insisted on staying put to conserve energy. The group fractured quickly, each species retreating into its own small cluster. Evan watched their disarray and felt an old, almost ancestral memory stir within him, something from the history books his grandfather used to show him back on Earth. He remembered black and white photos of men in thick fur coats, standing beside curved domes of snow, their eyes bright with resilience. The Inuit, the explorers of the Arctic, the climbers of Everest, all those who had faced cold with nothing but ingenuity. Humans had learned to make warmth out of the cold itself. That thought grounded him. He adjusted the strap of his pack and began walking a short distance away from the others, his boots crunching softly in the snow. The cold deepened quickly. The alien cadets' suits began to fail faster than expected. Their outer layers stiffened, condensation forming ice crusts on joints and seams. Auralin feathers froze solid, turning brittle and dull. The insectoids' movements slowed, their mandibles sluggish. Even Drav, the reptilian, dropped to one knee, his body struggling to maintain internal heat. A faint bluish fog began to roll across the plain, ice crystals forming from the moisture of their combined breath. In that eerie quiet, Evan knelt and started digging. He pressed his gloves into the snow, scooping, shaping, pressing. The others turned to stare at him, confusion mixing with exhaustion. "What are you doing?" one of the Orolin croaked, her voice muffled by a frozen mask. "Building," Evan said simply, his tone calm, almost meditative. His gloved hands moved in steady rhythm, cutting out rectangular blocks from the compacted snow. Each one was roughly the same size, and he stacked them in a gentle curve, the beginnings of a wall forming around him. The aliens murmured among themselves, their disbelief cutting through the wind. Building from snow seemed absurd, fragile, temporary, childish even. But Evan didn't stop. He carved a spiral trench, stacking blocks in a rising pattern, his breath puffing like smoke as he worked. The human body, even weakened, could draw warmth from motion, and his persistence was its own survival tactic. Hours passed in slow rhythm. The light began to fade into pale indigo, and the temperature dropped past the point where even the alien cadets' secondary circulatory systems could cope. The insectoid's eyes glazed over. The Orolin huddled together, trying to share body heat, their wings drooping. Evan's small wall had grown into a dome, curved and tight, the blocks leaning inward under their own weight, sealing the roof with precision that surprised even him. He crawled inside, breath echoing softly against the curved walls. For the first time since landing, he felt the air lose its bite. The dome held heat, not much, but enough that his eyelashes stopped freezing. He crawled back out and gestured toward the others. "It works," he said simply. "You can use the snow as insulation. The cold out there stays out if you trap the air inside." No one moved at first. The aliens stared at him as if he had gone mad. Then Drav took a cautious step forward. His scales had turned nearly gray, his movements slow, but curiosity won over pride. He knelt beside the human-made structure and touched the wall. The surface was firm, dense, and dry. He pressed his palm against it and felt, to his astonishment, the faintest warmth. His reptilian eyes widened. Without a word, he began helping Evan dig more blocks, copying his movements as best as his stiff claws allowed. The others watched as two figures, one human, one reptilian, worked side by side in the frozen dark, their breaths intertwining in clouds of mist. As night fully fell, the first stars of Careth 9 appeared, sharp and brilliant in the black sky. The temperature dropped so low that exposed skin could freeze in seconds. Yet inside the small dome, warmth began to build. The air trapped within the snow walls grew thick with vapor, and a fragile equilibrium formed, heat from their bodies radiating just enough to stay alive. Evan sat with his back against the curved wall, listening to the faint crackle of expanding ice. Drav was silent beside him, eyes half closed, conserving energy. Through the narrow entrance, the wind howled, but it no longer felt like a threat. It sounded almost distant, like waves breaking on another world. Before sleep claimed him, Evan looked out toward the scattered shapes of the other cadets, curled and trembling in the open snow. He knew most wouldn't survive the night if they stayed out there. Tomorrow, when he crawled through the narrow entrance, the outside cold struck his face with brutal sharpness. The wind had grown stronger overnight, carving thin ridges into the snow and scattering crystalline dust that glittered in the air like glass splinters. The landscape was silent except for the occasional creak of shifting ice. Evan squinted across the plain. Scattered bodies of the cadets dotted the field, not lifeless, but still and trembling. Those who had tried to survive in the open were in bad shape. Orolin cadets lay huddled under frozen feathers, their bodies stiff, their wings rimed with frost. The insectoids were buried up to their abdomens in snow pits, their movements slow and jerky. Drav, the reptilian who had shared the dome, emerged beside him, exhaling a weak hiss that steamed in the air. His scales were no longer dull gray but faintly green again. The shelter had saved him. Evan looked toward the others and made a decision without hesitation. The trial might have been designed to test individual endurance, but there was no survival in isolation. He grabbed the edge of the snow wall and began widening the dome's outer trench, his motions steady and deliberate. His gloves were stiff with frost, his fingers numb, yet he worked methodically, carving new blocks, stacking them in a slow, curved line beside the existing structure. Drav watched him in silence for a few minutes before joining in again, his clawed hands far more effective at cutting the dense snow. The wind caught the powdered flakes and lifted them around the two figures, shrouding them in a faint haze that sparkled like ground stars. Soon, one of the Auralin cadets stirred and stumbled toward them. She was smaller than most, her plumage pale gold under the frost, her movements hesitant. She stopped several meters away, shivering violently, her feathers twitching. "What is this?" she asked, her voice weak but curious. Evan straightened, his face partially hidden behind his frost-covered hood. "Shelter," he said simply. "The snow can trap air and block the wind. You can build walls thick enough to keep heat inside." The Auralin tilted her head in disbelief. "Snow kills. It freezes." "How can it save?" she said softly, almost to herself. Evan picked up a block of snow and tapped it with his glove. "It freezes only when you let it. If you pack it right, it becomes insulation. It keeps what warmth you already have." He didn't bother explaining the physics, the trapped air pockets, the slow heat exchange, because he could tell she wasn't ready to hear science. She was just cold and scared. He pointed to the dome's entrance. "Go inside," he said. "You'll feel it." The Auralin hesitated but finally crawled in. When she emerged a few moments later, her feathers were no longer trembling. There was a look of stunned relief in her wide eyes. Drav gave a short hiss that almost sounded like a laugh. "Warm enough to live," he said. "I told you he was right." The Auralin nodded silently and looked around at the other cadets scattered across the field. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "We should bring them here. The smallest ones won't last another hour." Evan looked up at the sun, though it was little more than a dim blur through the icy mist. He knew she was right. "Bring them," he said, "and tell them to bring anything they have, knives, claws, anything that can cut snow. We're building more." By mid-morning, the area around the original dome had become a hive of motion. The surviving cadets gathered slowly, drawn by the faint promise of warmth. They moved awkwardly, many still numb from the night, but their bodies followed the rhythm Evan had started. He showed them how to press snow into dense slabs using the weight of their arms or tails, how to angle the blocks inward so gravity held them together. His voice remained calm and steady even when his lips trembled from the cold. "Don't fight the snow," he said. "Shape it. It wants to hold." Some followed eagerly, like Drav and the Auralin, while others hesitated. A tall insectoid named Krish clicked his mandibles in suspicion. "This is primitive," he said sharply. "We are cadets of the academy, not cave dwellers. The instructors want adaptation, not superstition." Evan didn't look up from his work. "Then adapt," he replied. "You can wait for technology that won't come, or you can use what's here." Krish froze for a moment, his black eyes narrowing, then finally bent down to copy the human's motions. The pride in him still burned, but survival had a way of dimming arrogance. As the day went on, the construction multiplied. Domes rose one after another, small at first, then more complex as Evan guided the group to connect them with narrow tunnels. Each entrance faced away from the wind. He showed the cadets how to make double walls that trapped air between layers, and how to carve tiny vents near the top to prevent suffocation. His mind worked faster than his numb hands, calculating angles, remembering diagrams he had seen years ago in an old Earth survival manual. For a brief moment, the alien world felt almost familiar, like the frozen plains of the Arctic he had only ever seen in books. The Auralin cadet, whose name he finally learned was Sarah, moved beside him now, cutting snow blocks with surprising precision using her sharp wing claws. Her eyes glowed faintly gold in the weak sunlight. "You act as though you've done this before," she said softly. Evan smiled faintly under the frost on his beard. "Not me," he said. "Humans before me, long before spaceflight." Sarah tilted her head, puzzled by the thought of a species so fragile creating shelter out of the very thing that could kill it. She wanted to ask more, but a sudden gust of wind cut her words short. The wind grew harsher as the day faded. Clouds thickened, dimming the already weak sunlight until the world turned silver gray. The temperature plummeted again, and the ground began to tremble under the force of a rising storm. But this time, no one panicked. The first domes stood strong, the snow blocks settling tighter under pressure. When the storm arrived, the wind howled with enough force to tear apart metal panels, yet the curved structures only flexed slightly, their surfaces smooth and unbreakable. Inside, the sound of the blizzard was muted, reduced to a deep, rhythmic hum. Evan moved from dome to dome, checking each one's stability, sealing cracks with handfuls of loose snow. Every face he saw inside was changed, no longer blank with fear, but alive with determination. The cadets had begun to understand that survival wasn't about endurance alone. It was about adaptation, invention, and trust in instincts older than any machine. Drav sat in one dome, sharpening a shard of ice into a crude knife, while Sarah arranged feathers into small mats to keep cadets from lying directly on the freezing ground. Even Krish, the insectoid skeptic, worked silently, patching gaps with surprising care. When the storm finally eased near evening, the wind left behind a world transformed. The plain was covered in ridges of sculpted snow, and at its center stood a cluster of white domes glowing faintly in the dying light. From above, it would have looked like a colony of strange eggs huddled together for warmth. Evan stood outside, his body trembling with exhaustion, his gloves torn and stiff, but his eyes filled with quiet pride. The breath that came from his mouth turned instantly to mist and drifted upward, catching the faint light of the twin moons that now hung low on the horizon. He looked at the others gathering around the entrance to the largest dome. Sarah approached, carrying a handful of frozen twigs and pine-like needles she had found near a frost ridge. She offered them to him with a faint smile. "For the next thing you will make," she said. He didn't yet know what that would be, but something in the tone of her voice told him that the worst might finally be behind them. He took the bundle and nodded silently. The others watched him, waiting, trusting. For the first time since arriving on Careth 9, he realized he was no longer just surviving. He was leading, not through authority or rank, but through the quiet power of example. As the second night approached, the cold deepened to a level beyond comprehension, yet no one faced it alone anymore. Inside the linked domes, faint warmth gathered, pulsing softly like a heartbeat beneath the snow. Evan sat near the entrance, staring out into the frozen dusk. The storm had scoured the landscape clean, leaving behind silence so deep it felt sacred. He tightened his gloves and turned back toward the light glowing faintly from within the domes. The wind outside could rage for eternity, but in that fragile ring of snow and breath, humanity had already won. By the time the twin suns of Careth 9 rose again, the storm had passed, leaving a landscape sculpted into silent ridges and valleys. The snow glistened in pale gold, its surface hard as glass, and every breath sent shards of frost swirling in the thin air. Inside the growing network of domes, the cadets woke to the strange warmth of their fragile sanctuary. The air smelled faintly of ice and feathers, a blend of survival and exhaustion. For a few moments, no one spoke. Each cadet listened to the distant groan of the ice beneath them, realizing that the night had not claimed a single life. Evan stepped outside first. The cold struck him with the same merciless precision as always, but it no longer felt like an enemy. The wind had softened, and in its stillness he heard the quiet rhythm of the world itself, the faint crackling of frost forming on distant ridges, the whisper of air moving through snow tunnels, the breathing of those inside the domes. His hands ached from the work of the previous day, his fingers blistered beneath the gloves, but when he looked around at what they had built, a small, steady pride stirred in his chest. What had begun as desperation was now structure, purpose, and unity. The domes rose like white pearls from the snowfield, connected by low tunnels that curved gently between them. Each one was unique, some wider, some taller, a few even decorated with carved patterns where Aurelin claws had traced symbols of their home worlds. Smoke-like vapor curled faintly from ventilation holes, diffusing in the air and vanishing into the cold. The place looked almost alive, like an organism breathing beneath the ice. The others emerged soon after, blinking against the glare. Sarah stepped out of one tunnel, her golden feathers rimed with frost, but her movements graceful, almost defiant against the cold. Drav followed, his scales darkened again with returning warmth, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. Krish and the insectoid cadets moved in synchronized efficiency, their clicking mandibles filling the quiet. Evan turned toward them. "We can make more," he said simply. His voice was hoarse from the dry air, but it carried easily over the snow. "We build for everyone now. No one stays outside tonight." The words were plain, not a command but a statement of fact, and the others accepted them without question. He pointed toward a cluster of flat terrain beyond the main shelters. "There. We can expand." Sarah tilted her head, a faint gleam of curiosity in her eyes. "You want to build a colony?" she asked. Evan nodded once. "A city. Just enough to survive the next storm." The work began immediately. The cadets divided themselves naturally, as if instinct had finally found its rhythm. The insectoids used their serrated limbs to cut clean blocks of snow faster than any tool could have done. The Aurelin formed teams to carry and stack, their lightweight bodies perfect for balancing across fragile bridges of packed frost. The reptilians dug trenches with precision, using their heavy tails to smooth surfaces. Evan moved among them constantly, guiding with gestures more than words, showing how each wall should curve inward to balance weight, how entrances must stay narrow and shielded from the prevailing wind. Sarah became his silent assistant, observing every move he made, learning the shape of his methods. Her delicate claws traced arcs in the air when she repeated his explanations to others, translating his logic into patterns her people understood. "The walls breathe," she said once, demonstrating the air vents. "They trap heat and let the bad air escape. The snow listens if you build with care." Her calm voice carried through the working lines, and even the most skeptical cadets began to believe that the material they once feared could now protect them. Hours passed in relentless rhythm. The suns climbed, casting a dull light that barely warmed the air. Frost gathered on eyebrows, on wing edges, on the ridges of scales, yet no one stopped. The sound of carving and stacking echoed across the plain, blending with the wind until it became a strange, harmonious music, the heartbeat of survival itself. The new domes took shape, linked by tunnels that intersected like veins. Some cadets even began to name their sections: the South Nest, the Ridge Path, the Warm Hall. Each dome represented not only shelter, but identity, proof that they had built something with their own hands instead of waiting to be saved. By afternoon, the city of snow was real. A dozen domes stood in connected rows, their entrances facing different angles so that no wind could pass straight through. Inside, the air was noticeably warmer, the humidity rising from the collective breathing of many species. Frost crystals sparkled on the inner walls like stars. The cadets had learned to place thin layers of dried frost moss, a brittle lichen found near the ice ridges, between the blocks for insulation. Drav, who had discovered the moss, moved through the tunnels distributing handfuls of it to each builder, his deep voice rumbling in quiet satisfaction. Evan paused for the first time that day and watched the others work. The exhaustion in his limbs was heavy, but it was a good kind of weight, the kind that meant something was being built not just with effort, but with meaning. He leaned against one of the domes and looked at the horizon. The sky had taken on a faint crimson hue, a warning that another front of storms might be approaching. He knew the pattern by now. Careth 9 never stayed calm for long, But this time, he was ready. Sarah approached him, her feathers glinting faintly in the dying light. "You could have let us fail," she said quietly. "The instructors would have marked your survival higher if you focused only on yourself." Evan gave a tired smile. "Maybe, but I wasn't raised to watch others die when I can help." Sarah studied him for a long moment, her eyes reflecting the pale sun's. "Your kind are strange," she said. "You build warmth where others see only cold. You call danger a lesson, and somehow you make it true." He looked at her and nodded once. "Maybe we just remember what it means to be small. Cold teaches that faster than anything." Their brief exchange was interrupted by a call from Krish, who stood near the farthest dome. "The structure bends under pressure," the insectoid hissed sharply. Evan ran toward him, his boots crunching through the snow. The top of the dome had begun to sag slightly where the angle of the blocks had shifted. Without hesitation, he crawled to the side and pressed his gloved hand against the inner wall. "It's fine," he said calmly. "We reinforce it here." He gestured for Krish to cut a smaller block and slide it inside the curve, wedging it like a keystone. When they did, the structure tightened, the crack sealing instantly. The dome stood firm again. Krish blinked, mandibles twitching in quiet respect. "You understand the snow," he said softly. "It listens to you." Evan shook his head. "It listens to everyone who pays attention." As the second sunset bled across the ice fields, the city glowed with life. The cadets had placed luminescent fungi from the cargo kits inside hollowed ice jars, lighting the tunnels with gentle blue and violet hues. The soft glow reflected off the snow walls, turning the interiors into dreamlike chambers where cold looked warm. Inside one of the larger domes, a group of cadets gathered to rest. Sarah sat near the center, plucking a few strands from her frozen feathers and weaving them into thin cords to bind the next day's blocks. Drav lay stretched across the floor, conserving heat, his tail curled around the base of a wall like a guardian's coil. Krish cleaned frost from his claws with focused precision. Evan watched them from the entrance, listening to the low murmur of voices. No one argued now. No one complained. The storm had united them in ways the Academy's instructors had probably never intended. Survival had become more than endurance. It had become cooperation, empathy, and creativity. He realized, almost with a shiver, that this lesson would outlast the trial itself. These aliens, each from worlds so different from his own, would carry the memory of this human-made city long after Kareth 9 faded from sight. Outside, the temperature continued to fall, but the city endured. The vents exhaled faint columns of steam that drifted upward and dissolved into the air. The domes creaked gently, adjusting under their own weight, but none collapsed. Evan stood alone for a while under the dim stars, his breath rising like smoke. He felt the ache of cold deep in his bones, but it no longer frightened him. It was simply part of the world now, a quiet, endless reminder of where strength was born. When he finally crawled back inside, he found the others asleep, their bodies radiating shared warmth into the still air. Evan lay down near the curved wall and closed his eyes, listening to the distant hum of wind outside the tunnels. In the darkness, his thoughts drifted between exhaustion and wonder. He could not know that what he had built would later become legend, a symbol of what humans brought to the stars, the stubborn ability to turn even the deadliest cold into shelter, to find home where no home existed. But for now, he simply let the rhythm of the snow city lull him into sleep, as the breath of many species mingled softly in the night, alive beneath the frozen sky of Kareth 9. The third day dawned without warmth. The twin suns hung pale and distant, dimmed by a haze of frost that glittered like crushed diamonds in the air. The city of snow no longer looked fragile. It stood proud and firm against the wind, a cluster of white domes breathing faint trails of vapor that marked it as alive. Inside those domes, the cadets woke slowly, their bodies aching but their spirits steadier than ever. The trial had stripped them of arrogance, fear, and the illusion of control, but in its place, it had given them something purer, a sense of unity, born from survival itself. Evan rose from his spot near the wall and rubbed his stiff hands together. His gloves were cracked from the cold, his skin raw beneath them, but he no longer noticed the pain. The air inside the dome had grown heavy with moisture overnight, and faint droplets clung to the walls, freezing and thawing in slow rhythm. When he crawled outside, the light nearly blinded him. The snow had hardened into a smooth surface, reflecting the suns like mirrors. He shielded his eyes and surveyed the small city he had helped create. Each dome was intact. The vents puffed thin spirals of air. For the first time since arrival, he allowed himself to believe they would all survive. Drav, I thought it might help. Evan took the bundle from her hands and inhaled. The needles gave off a sharp, clean aroma, almost sweet beneath the frost. He felt an idea stir. "We can make tea," he said suddenly. "Boil water, let this steep. It's rich in nutrients and it will lift everyone's spirits." Drav tilted his head, skeptical. "Boil water? With what fire?" Evan smiled faintly. "With what the sun gives us." He pointed upward, then toward a wide, flat piece of reflective metal that had once been part of a fallen supply container. The light glared off it with blinding intensity. "A solar still," he murmured. "We can focus the light." He gathered a few cadets and explained quickly what to do. Krish and the other insectoids used their razor limbs to shape the metal into a shallow concave mirror. Sarah spread her feathers to test the angles of light, helping to align the reflection onto a small mound of dark rock where Evan placed a metal bowl filled with snow. When the sunbeam hit it, the snow began to melt, dripping slowly into liquid. The process was painfully slow, but within an hour steam curled upward and droplets hissed into vapor. It was primitive, fragile, and brilliant all at once. By afternoon, they had collected enough warm water to fill several cups carved from ice. Evan dropped the pine needles inside, watching them swirl and release faint green hues. The air filled with a subtle fragrance, soft but vibrant against the metallic cold. He handed the first cup to Sarah, who cradled it gently, the steam fogging her face. She took a cautious sip, and her eyes widened in surprise. "It's sweet," she whispered. "It tastes alive." Evan smiled. "It's Earth's way of fighting the cold." Soon, every dome was filled with the faint sound of clinking ice cups and quiet laughter. The cadets gathered in the largest shelter, the warmest one, where soft light from the luminescent fungi reflected off the curved walls like rippling stars. The storm outside was beginning to rise again. The wind howled faintly through the vents, but inside there was peace. The scent of pine tea drifted through the tunnels, mingling with the warmth of shared breath. For the first time since landing, the cadets were not just surviving. They were living. Evan sat near the entrance, his back against the wall, holding his own cup between trembling hands. He watched as Sarah and Drav exchanged quiet words with Krish, their differences forgotten in the soft glow of the dome. The insectoid's sharp voice had lost its arrogance. It was measured now, thoughtful. When the storm arrived, it struck hard. Gusts roared across the plain, shaking the domes. Snow whipped in every direction, and the horizon vanished behind a wall of white. Inside, the sound was distant, muffled by the thick walls. The cadets gathered closer, the glow of fungi lighting their faces. Sarah sat beside Evan, her wings folded tightly around her shoulders. She reached for her cup, now filled again with the last of the pine tea. "When I return to the academy," she said softly, "I will tell them that the cold did not break us. It taught us to listen." Evan turned to her. "What will you tell them about humans?" She smiled faintly. "That you are stubborn beyond reason, and that stubbornness might be what keeps the galaxy alive." The wind outside screamed, battering the snow domes with relentless fury. Frost crept along the outer walls, and small crystals drifted through the vents like falling stars. Yet the temperature inside remained bearable, the air warm with breath and steam. Someone began to hum, a low, rhythmic sound from one of the reptilian cadets, and soon others joined in, each species adding a tone. The sound blended into something wordless and vast, an improvised hymn that filled the tunnels like a heartbeat. Evan closed his eyes and listened. The vibration of voices echoed through the walls, merging with the hum of the wind until both became indistinguishable. In that strange, fragile harmony, the cold lost its power. The blizzard could rage for hours, days even, but it could no longer reach the hearts of those who had found fire in one another. When the storm finally began to fade, it was long past midnight. The sky inside, the cadets were sleeping peacefully, their breaths slow and steady. He placed his empty cup in the snow and smiled faintly. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "we build higher." The auroras shimmered above, their light gliding softly over the city of snow, and for the first time since landing on Careth 9, the frozen world felt almost like home. The fourth dawn rose slowly over Careth 9, gilding the horizon in muted silver light that shimmered across the endless ice fields. The storm had passed, leaving the air unnaturally clear and still. The city of snow stood untouched in the silence, its domes glowing faintly under the twin suns. Wisps of mist coiled upward from the vents, dissolving into a fragile morning calm. Inside, the cadets stirred from exhausted sleep, each body heavy with fatigue but filled with a quiet sense of triumph. The long night had not broken them. It had remade them. Evan woke to the soft hum of breathing around him. The air was warmer now, heavy with condensation that glistened on the curved walls. He lay still for a moment, listening. No one shivered. No one whispered in fear. The sound of life was steady, synchronized, and peaceful. When he finally rose and stepped toward the entrance, his movement disturbed a few patches of frost, and thin flakes drifted from the ceiling like slow snow. He crawled outside, pushing through the narrow tunnel until he emerged into the open. The light hurt his eyes at first, but when he blinked, the sight before him took his breath away. The entire field glittered like crystal. The city, once a desperate cluster of shelters, now looked deliberate, an architectural pattern of survival etched into the frozen landscape. Each dome gleamed under the faint sunlight, smooth and strong, the product of hands that had refused to surrender. Evan felt his chest tighten with quiet pride. For the first time, he could see beauty in the cold. He rubbed his frost-bitten hands together, warming them with his breath, then turned as Sarah stepped out behind him. She moved carefully, her feathers dusted with fine frost, her face serene. When she saw the view, her eyes widened in awe. "It looks alive," she said softly. Evan nodded. "It is," he replied. "We made it that way." Drav emerged next, stretching his thick arms and hissing softly as the sunlight hit his scales. He inhaled deeply, his breath rising like smoke. "I can smell the air again," he said. "It doesn't hurt to breathe." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of survival, the raw astonishment of still being alive after what should have killed them all. The other cadets began to step out one by one, blinking against the glare, each face lit by the strange stillness of morning. No one spoke for several minutes. There was nothing to say that could match the quiet grandeur of the frozen world around them. Then, far in the distance, a low hum rippled through the air. Heads turned upward in unison. The sky shimmered faintly, and soon the shape of a descending vessel appeared above the horizon. A sleek, silver transport marked with the insignia of the Galactic Survival Academy. The trial was over. Evan's heart tightened. The instructors had returned to retrieve them. He glanced toward Sarah, who watched the ship with mixed emotion, relief tangled with something softer, almost sadness. "It's strange," she murmured. "I thought I would rejoice when it ended, but now it feels as if we're leaving something sacred behind." Evan understood. The trial had become more than a test. It was a memory carved into their bones, something that no lesson or medal could replace. The ship descended slowly, kicking up a storm of snow as its thrusters ignited. The cadets shielded their faces until the engines quieted, leaving a deep silence broken only by the soft hiss of the ramp lowering. Two instructors in mirrored visors stepped out, their movements mechanical and impassive. One of them scanned the area and paused, as if unsure of what he was seeing. Before them stretched an entire settlement, domes, tunnels, vents, and paths, crafted with symmetry and purpose. It looked less like the aftermath of a survival test and more like the founding of a colony. The lead instructor stepped forward, his voice distorted through the comms. "Cadets, identify yourselves." Evan stepped ahead, straight-backed despite his fatigue. His voice was steady. "Cadet Evan Cole, Human Division, Acting Survival Coordinator." The instructor's helmet tilted slightly. "Coordinator?" he repeated. "Explain." Evan gestured toward the city behind him. "We survived by building. The storms destroyed our equipment, but the snow became our resource. We used it to make shelter, heat traps, and water filters. Every species here worked together." The second instructor, a woman with a sharp, clipped tone, approached the nearest dome and pressed her gloved hand to its wall. She hesitated when she felt the warmth radiating from within. Her voice softened slightly. "You built all this by hand?" Evan nodded. "By necessity." The instructors exchanged a brief, silent look. Then the male instructor turned toward the group. "The trial was designed to measure endurance, not civilization," he said. "But you've proven something beyond expectation." His visor caught the sunlight, reflecting a faint glimmer of respect. "Report to the vessel. You have passed." The announcement rippled through the cadets. Some sighed in relief, others laughed weakly, their exhaustion breaking at last. Sarah lingered beside Evan, her eyes still fixed on the domes. "Do you think the Academy will remember this?" she asked quietly. Evan looked at her, then at the settlement. "Maybe," he said. "But even if it doesn't, we will." They gathered what little they had and began walking toward the ship. As the ramp lifted behind them, the wind swept through the field again, erasing their footprints, but leaving the domes untouched. The instructors stood silent at the viewport, watching the structures shrink into white specks below. "I've never seen anything like it," the woman said softly. The man nodded. "Neither have I. Humanity's reputation for improvisation. It's more than rumor." Inside the transport, the cadets sat quietly, each lost in thought. The warmth of the ship felt strange now, almost too much after the clean, cold air of Careth 9. Sarah sat near the window, her golden feathers dimmed by fatigue but still beautiful. She turned to Evan and smiled faintly. "You changed the meaning of survival," she said. "You taught us that it's not about waiting for rescue. It's about becoming it." Evan looked out the window, watching the white moon recede beneath them. He thought of snow melting in his hands, shaping itself into walls, into domes, into hope. And he thought of the moment when the city had come alive, not because of his effort alone, but because every soul around him had chosen to believe that survival could be built, not just endured. When the ship entered orbit, the pilot's voice echoed through the cabin. "Transmission to the Academy complete. Debriefing scheduled on arrival." The cadets barely reacted. Words like debriefing and assessment had lost their meaning. What mattered now was the silence between them, the calm born from having faced death and created life in return. As the stars drifted outside the viewport, Sarah leaned closer and whispered, "What will you do when we return?" Evan opened his eyes and looked at her. "I'll sleep," he said with a tired smile. "Then I'll find another cold place and see what it wants to teach me next." She laughed softly, the sound warm and melodic. "You sound like someone who belongs to the frost now." He shook his head. "No, just someone who learned to listen to it." The ship turned toward the Academy's main orbital station, its engines leaving a faint silver wake across the dark. Far below, the domes of Careth 9 stood untouched, silent monuments to resilience. The next storm would come and eventually bury them beneath drifts of ice, but their shapes would remain hidden under the surface, preserved in the frozen memory of the world. And long after the cadets had returned to their lives across the stars, stories would circulate through the Academy. Stories of the human who melted the snow, who turned cold into warmth, who taught the galaxy that survival was an art of connection. When the transport finally docked, Evan glanced one last time at the fading light of Careth 9 through the viewport. The reflection of the moon lingered in his eyes like a ghost of the storm. He felt no pride, only calm understanding. The trial had not been about proving superiority or strength. It had been about remembering something older than technology, the simple truth that life endures when hearts endure together. He stood as the cabin lights brightened and the doors hissed open. The cadets followed behind him, quiet and steady, no longer the frightened group that had once descended into ice. As they stepped into the bright corridors of the Academy, a soft gust of recycled air brushed his face, strangely warm, almost like breath against frost. For a fleeting moment, he missed the cold. Then he smiled to himself and walked forward, the sound of his boots echoing on polished metal. Behind him, the stars turned, and somewhere far away, on a moon of eternal winter, the city of snow still waited under the dawn, silent, whole, and immortal.